Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fraser, in court documents filed in 2021, you contended that, quote, as the services explained in their final rules, the 2019 revisions to the Section 4 and Section 7 regulations did not substantively change how the Fish and Wildlife Service lists species, designated critical habitat, or performs intra-agency consultations under the ESA. The revisions clarified our existing regulations to make them more consistent with the statutory language, case law, and existing agency practices, end quote. If your statement from these documents is accurate, why is the service moving forward with revising these rulemakings?
The Endangered Species Act is clearly a substantive statute with a lot of people that are interested in understanding exactly how we carry out our responsibilities. We have found that the 2019 final rules still leave some areas that are open to misunderstanding and confusion, both for our practitioners and the public. Those are the sorts of changes that we're focusing upon in our current proposal.
Mr. Fraser, in 2013, the now U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Director Martha Williams authored an article with other Obama administration officials stating that critical habitat designations, quote, have very little impact from a, quote, conservation perspective. Do you agree?
I believe that that paper was written when the director was in a private capacity or non-government capacity.
Agree or disagree?
I find that critical habitat has some value, limited regulatory impact in most circumstances, but also has information value to identify for the public what areas are important for recovery.
It sounds like you agree with her statement from 2013, whether she wrote it in a private context or not. You agree that there's very limited impact that critical habitat has. Is that correct?
My job is primarily to implement the decisions that Congress made. They directed us to designate critical habitat.
But I'm asking you a question about your observations as an employee of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. What have been your observations?
Our observations is that it rarely makes a major difference in Section 7 consultations when we're dealing with an impact to species as well.
Well, in light of that, wouldn't you agree that designating unsuitable areas as critical habitat it only provokes the Supreme Court, alienates landowners, directs our limited resources to things that don't matter, and actually distracts from recovering the species? Wouldn't you agree with that?
We would never be designating unsuitable areas. We sometimes designate areas that were not occupied at the time of listing, but that all the designation are for areas essential for recovery of the species.
Well, coming from Wyoming, I would respectfully disagree. Mr. Fraser, I'd like to ask you a separate question on Section 4D. This rule gets its name from Section 4D of the ESA, which directs the Secretary of Interior and therefore the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to issue regulations deemed necessary and advisable to provide for the conservation of threatened species. The common thing we hear from the service is that tailored 4D rules are too expensive to do, but nobody ever says how much they actually cost. Mr. Fraser, how much does it cost for the service to develop a tailored 4D rule?
That would depend upon the nature of the 4D rule and the species that we're talking about.
Can you give me any kind of ranges?
I don't have that information right on the top of my head. We'd be happy to get back with you.
Okay. We will request that additional information. And I would like to have that because, again, there's the claim that it's too expensive, but we never get actual numbers. So I'd like to get real specific numbers. Mr. Fraser, the proposed rule removes the directive for the Secretary to delist a species if it meets the necessary conditions based on the best available science by replacing the current requirement that the Secretary shall delist a species if it meets that criteria, and replaces it with it is appropriate to delist the species if. In other words, you're changing the language and the terminology, and you're taking a directive and turning it into essentially what is mush, in my opinion. The rationale provided by the service is that this will remove potential for confusion or concerns that the service can or will take immediate action to delist. But this change appears to be both anti-science and contrary to the congressional intent of the Endangered Species Act. If the motivation is truly to provide clarification, why not just state that public notice and comment will be provided prior to delisting?
That proposed revision to our listing rules is one of those areas where there was confusion, and so we're seeking to clarify that through the proposed changes here.
To make it so that instead of requiring delisting, if the recovery criteria have been met, it will be up to the Secretary of Interior as to whether they want to go forward with delisting. Is that right?
Well, the Secretary has the final say, or acting through the Director of the Fish and Wildlife Service.
Sure, but right now the
Oh,
statute.
I'm sorry, the gentlelady's time has expired.
Thank you.